This is the Digital Transition Podcast, produced by the Institute of Communication of Nova University of Lisbon. The Digital Transition Podcast is an initiative of the Doctoral Seminar on Contemporary Culture and Technology with the collaboration of its students.
The following is a conversation with Yuk Hui, one of the most eminent thinkers on the multiple intersections between technology, politics, and aesthetics. We are very honored to have him as our first guest on the Digital Transition Podcast at the Nova Institute of Communication. Yuk Hui's work is based on a rigorous dialogue between Eastern thought and the Western philosophical tradition, as well as between a more humanistic thought and the so-called hard sciences. The range of Yuk Hui's interests is immediately evident in his educational and academic background. He studied computer engineering at the University of Hong Kong and philosophy at Goldsmiths College in London, where he wrote his doctoral thesis on the existence of digital objects under the guidance of French philosopher Bernard Stiegler. Since then, he has an extensive academic CV, which includes his aggregation in philosophy of technique at the University of Lunenburg, the postdoctoral research he conducted at the Institut de Recherche et d'Innovation of the Centre Georges Pompidou, among many other projects he has supervised and institutions at which he has taught. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages and cover many of the most pressing and urgent issues in contemporary thought. We're talking about works such as The Question Concerning Technology in Sine, an essay in Cosmotechnics, Recursivity and Contingency, Art and Cosmotechnics, and his most recent essays, both published in 2024, Machine and Sovereignty and Post-Europe.
The European official political discourse, including that of research policies, organizes around two parallel but also interconnected agendas: the green transition and the digital transition, in which the digital supposedly contributes to the general ecological sustainability. In one of your essays, in turn, you state, "The real problem of the Anthropocene is that of a gigantic cybernetic system in the process of realization." Could you please elaborate a little bit on this thought? Does it support recent, less optimistic views of an AI-driven digital transition, which speaks of its existential risk for humanity?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Very complex, but I think first of all we can recognize that now in this green transition, but also digital transition, what is most significant is the question of infrastructure, of technological infrastructure, and that is underlined in all these proposals. The green transition, of course, as we all know about the Green New Deal, which proposed that to reduce the carbon dioxide emission, but at the same time we have to keep the employment, we have to maintain the same kind of GDP, productivity, and so on. And on the other hand, different countries are exploring the use of digital technologies, the construction, development of smart cities, of digitize almost everything we can think of today. Without a smartphone, it's almost impossible to access your bank accounts, to make even to use your credit card, because you have to use your smartphone to confirm your order, for example, and it kind of forces everyone to have a smartphone and to become digital, even regardless how you are, and I think it is happening everywhere. You firstly, where in China was started earlier, but now in Europe I think it's the same. But I think what is so interesting is that both of them actually focus on technological development. But there was no questioning of technology itself, right? So what was proposed in these two transitions is actually creates a new kind of competition between different countries. technological acceleration. And I think it is very clear already in almost a decade ago, for example, in 2017, on the 1st of September, when Putin gave a speech to the Russian children on the 1st of September, he claimed that whoever leads in AI will dominate the world. So we see here that the development of AI, which is the digital transition, but also what underlies the green transition, because the green transition also demands the use of digital technologies and so on. For example, with electric cars, which is kind of a fully digitized car that we can use for navigation and so on. So the two are actually quite related, and what we are seeing is that this competition towards a technological system which connects every infrastructure at the same time moving towards higher speed and higher efficiency. So this is what we are observing now in China, in the USA, and in all the countries. But with this speeding up, are we going to really resolve the problem that we are confronting, or it is actually repeating the same path, but with some kind of minor modifications? That's my question, but not only my question, but also a question of many other people's. So, for example, there are other people who propose degrowth, which is a very important subject. And what does it mean by degrowth? Is to change the parameters that we use to measure our economic development, to reduce our productivity, to reduce the number of populations today in the world, and so on, and to move towards the common, which is to say more kind of communist ideal of the commons. But again, for me, I think the problem of degrowth is that it undermines very much the question of technology. It understands that the most important factor is still the question of private property. So that's why the commons is the ultimate goal of this movement called degrowth. But for me, I think that today, if we really want to overcome the problem that we are witnessing and we're experiencing, which is climate collapse, we don't know when it's going to happen, but we know that something has changed significantly. AI apocalypse, which is everyone is talking about this, mass unemployment and so on. Ecological problems everywhere. I think we have to go back to the question of technology to really question this homogeneous understanding of technology and technological development. So this is why I said that what is happening today is maybe we can say that in different countries there have been attempts to create gigantic cybernetic system that integrates all different infrastructures, banking, logistics, and so on into a singular system. And I don't know how much you experience this in the Netherlands, but for example, in the Netherlands and in many Asian countries, this is already the case. In terms of governance, that one has a digital ID that you can apply for everything, for banking, for transport, for tax, for so on. So I think, but of course, what underlies this is it's not only about surveillance, but also the understanding of the individual's behaviors, and in order to predict what might be the optimal decision for the government, the optimal operation for a private cooperate, for example, logistic company and so on. So that's why I think that I make such a claim that the real problem is that we, in all these proposals, green transition, digital transition, or even degrowth, there is a tendency to undermine the question of technology. So, of course, in the green transition and digital transition is not only, it's a different form of undermining, because they actually propose technology that we have to speed up and so on. But there is a lack of questioning of what kind of technology is necessary, or how can we diversify the technological developments. Instead, we are all competing towards one a kind of a very similar technological system. And the problem with degrowth is that still is a very good Marxist reading of the problem of capitalism. That's to say, private property is the central problem, the key problem, and if we resolve this, then capitalism collapses. But as we know, this is debatable, and I think Simondon has explained this very clearly, and I think it's very convincing. On the mode of existence of technical objects, Simondon criticized Marx by saying that the economic factor, such as a private property, only intensifies the problem, but it is not the fundamental source of alienation. It's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that there is a lack of understanding of technology. And if we want to overcome alienation, we want to overcome the current status of capitalism, then we need to rethink technology in a more profound way. So, this is also very different. What I propose is also very different from what you said, AI-driven digital transition, which speaks of existential risk for humanity, because you know what happened recently, which is the closure of the institutes of the I forgot what it's called, the institutes in Oxford, led by Nick Bostrom. The future of humanities, yeah, and it is closed because, well, of course, there are many speculations on how and why this happened. But I think one message is very clear, is that this way of thinking super intelligence, or proposing industrial propaganda about mass unemployment, of AI collapse, is not it's not very helpful for us to think about our future. So that regardless of what, for what reason is it closed, it's for me very clear that this path that has been proposed by them is not working. And for me, this is the real reason.
Cybernetics is the name for that monolithic technology and epistemology, right? That you're speaking about. Hence, this second question, dealing with the difficulty of thinking how to go beyond. What does it mean to go beyond cybernetics? So, is there nevertheless a minimum invariant anthropological history of technique, that of a co-evolution between the human and technique through the exteriorization and interiorization of a technical milieu? Or is this a mere Western Promethean tale? If not, can the ecological and organological model of cybernetics, or what you call the organismic model at the heart of cybernetics, be the culmination of the minimum invariant history of technique, leaving us with a technical diversity that might be no more than the variance of cybernetics?
Right. So, how can we start, or where to start? Because it's a very complex question. First of all, you talk about the the kind of is a co-evolution between human and technic, mere Western Promethean tale. Well, I don't think so. I think this thesis about externalization, internalization was, of course, now today we refer to anthropology, and later maybe I come back to this point regarding André Leroi-Gourhan. But I think before Leroi-Gourhan, actually Hegel has already talked about that. That's to say that the development or the progress of the spirit of the Geist has two dimensions. It's a recurrent or recursive process that involves, on the one hand, exteriorization, or what you call an Äußerung. And then you need another process, which is Erinnerung, a recollection. And this is what characterized the movement of the spirit. Exteriorize, interiorize, or internalize, and then the spirit, based on this process, can move towards a more concrete or a more universal concept. So this is a general, I think this is a very general idea to understand the relation between human and technology. And this, of course, after Hegel, it was picked up by another person who was a student of Hegel, Hans Kapp, who has written a book called The Outlines of a Philosophy of Technology, which we can say probably the first philosophical text or precisely on the question of technology, where he basically picked up the same. He followed the Hegelian understanding of externalization and internalization to describe the process of technological developments as the projection of human organs or biological organs, and as the process of the complexification of this organ projection. So I think this is maybe we can say that it is a basic way, or could we say a universal, because the term universal is a very problematic and complex way to describe the evolution of the human being. But inside this process of internalization and externalization, it's actually quite complex. And that will bring us back to the work of André Leroi-Gourhan, because Leroi-Gourhan is the person who in anthropology tried to describe very precisely the invention of tools as, and also writing, as a process of externalization. The externalization of memories, but also the liberation of our bodily organs, because with forks and knife, then I don't need to use my finger. But of course, earlier we can also find, for example, in Marx and Engels' writing, especially Engels' writing on dialectics of nature, for example. So, but in André Leroi-Gourhan, what is so interesting is that he wanted to complicate this process of internalization and externalization by introducing two other concepts. One he called technical tendency, the other technical fact. So what is technical tendency? Technical tendency, maybe we can understand it as the tendency that is underlined by laws of nature. So for example, in the history of technology, we find the invention of wheel for transportation, almost every civilization. And all of them around. We have never seen a wheel which is triangular or square. It's all round. So then we can use fix it, use for wagons for transportation. We can say this is technical tendency. Today we have different technical tendency, which is digitization. Digital technology is a tendency. But he also introduced another concept, technical fact, which is not, for example, universal laws of physics, but rather something that is conditioned by the contingent encounter between technical tendency and a locality. A locality meaning what he called it, the internal milieu, that is to say, the culture, the customs inside the tribe. But also the external milieu, which is the specific geographical location where the tribe is situated. And these internal, external milieus actually, when they encounter the technical tendency, they produce something very different. That's to say, when the same tendency arrive or propagates to Asia and to Africa, actually they produce different kind of techniques. Even though every two have to follow physical laws, otherwise they will not work. So I try to interpret what André Roy says about technical tendency and technical fact by proposing what I called an antinomy of the universality of technology. Well, because in your question about externalization and internalization, we could say that this is anthropologically universal. We find it in almost every culture, and we can use to test our observations or our ethnological studies of different cultures. But so on the one hand, there is a universal dimension, which is the exteriorization technology as exteriorization of memory and liberation of bodily organs. But on the other hand, there was something that is produced, which is extra to this universal description. That are the technical facts. So this antinomy, when we separate them, each of them looks correct. Actually, for me, is diffuses and antifuses are equally important. There is a universal dimension, but there is also a non-universal dimension. Now I use the term dimension because I don't want to substantialize the universal, but there's one universal dimension, such as what you said, externalization, internalization. But there's another dimension which is not universal, and that actually allow a particularity, or even we can say a singularization, to take place. So now let's look at what is the question of cybernetics, because cybernetics is I believe that we live in the age of cybernetics, even though we don't really speak often about cybernetics. If you read newspaper, you will not find the word cybernetics today, and because cybernetics was a discipline. It was not really a discipline, but it was, maybe we can say, a universal discipline proposed in the 1940s. And that was become very popular during the Cold War and so on. But in the, let's say, towards the end of the 20th century, the word almost disappeared. If you study computer science, information science, you rarely saw this word cybernetics. Why is so? People would say cybernetics is already the past. Cybernetics is obsolete. But for me, I think the opposite is true. Is because cybernetics is everywhere, so you don't even need to say it. It is in all disciplines, in biology, bioinformatics, in computer science, AI, machine learning, and even human science, philosophy, for example. So we are living in the epoch of cybernetics, and these cybernetic machines are used everywhere because, for example, this camera you're using, the smartphone I'm using, we are all inside the cybernetic systems or cybernetic feedback loops, for example, in one way or another. So for me, the question is that given this model of cybernetic based on feedback on information, which we can use almost everywhere and so on, how could we think like André Leclerc to think about the possibility of technical fact and also the implication of technical fact? What is the political implication of technical fact? It's not only to say that now we have Airbnb and I'm going to study how people in Lisbon use Airbnb and how people in, for example, in Tokyo use Airbnb. Of course, they have different way of communicating with users, between users. But this is not what I call technical, what we can say technical fact. Because I think what André Leclerc called technical fact is actually a different kind of tendency. It's also a technical tendency. And this sounds very confusing because he called technical tendency and the technical fact. But for me, technical fact is a tendency of particularization, of diversification. Why? Is because these two terms, or at least this term tendency, is taken from Bergson. From Bergson's the two sources of morality and religion. This book is about tendency, about a tendency and a counter-tendency. So according to Bergson, there is one tendency, and this tendency will continue to grow until one moment this tendency encounter its own limit, and then the counter-tendency will come in. For example, mechanism and mysticism. These are two tendencies. André Leclerc was a reader of Bergson, and he took up this concept of tendency. So was Simondon, because when you look at Simondon's On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, the word tendency was everywhere, especially in the third part of his book. The word tendency appeared at least 28 times. So technical tendency and technical facts are actually two tendencies. And when one tendency comes to a certain limit, then the counter tendency will have to work, have to operate. And I think that today we are in a situation, we are in a different condition, which we can call the planetary technological condition. Then earlier we speak about the competition of technical systems, of homogeneous technical systems, which interestingly we can compare with what Alexander Kojève called universal homogeneous state. The concept of the states or the political states as the universal and homogeneous concept. So I think that what we need is, or at least according to my reading of Leclerc, but also of Bergson and Simondon, is that today we have to problematize this tendency, what Leclerc calls technical tendency, which is something conceived to be universal, or at least we are witnessing a universalization process of the cybernetic systems, which are earlier described as the kind of battlefield competition between different sovereign states. And to come back to the question of technical facts, or which I would rather say a different, an opposite tendency of diversification. However, as I said, that this question is of diversification is not yet is not yet on the table for our political and technological discussions, and that's what I propose. It's not to reject cybernetics. It's not to say that cybernetics is universalizing, so it's bad. No, what I'm proposing is that cybernetics is a universalizing. We can say that it is a technical tendency, such as the digital, which is asserting its force, its power everywhere. But what we need is also a counter tendency, which allow us to think how to diversify the cybernetic machines.
So, staying on the topic of techno-diversity, I would like to ask you a question that is a bit more political in nature, and here it goes. So, the idea of Cosmotechnics implies that democratization also means the diversification of technology. As such, you have distanced yourself from those who praise the emancipatory power of the current monoculture of social media, Instagram, Facebook, etc. But is it possible that these few platforms have already redefined our very notion of democracy, the way photography redefined the notion of art, according to Benjamin? And if so, how can we undo such an intoxication?
Thank you very much. I think maybe we should go back to Benjamin, and I think what Benjamin said in his time and our time is very different, different context. Why I'm saying this is because, of course, when we refer to the famous essay of Benjamin written in 1935-36, where he argues that it is futile to ask if photography and cinema is art or not. What is more important is to ask how these new technologies of his time, meaning photography and cinema, change the nature of art. Because what Benjamin saw is that there is a democratization of art introduced by technical apparatus such as camera and video camera and so on. I think that Benjamin was right to say, to make such a claim at his time, because he has a political mission. He has to fight against fascism. He wants to reintroduce a kind of democratization of the art, which was controlled by a certain way of defining what art is, how art should be. So this is the contribution of Benjamin, and that is Benjamin is a good Marxist. And what he said is shows also the gesture of a good Marxist. But it was not yet the time of consumerism. It was not yet the time of what we live today. That's to say, there is a marriage between industry and consumerism. Today, the apparatus or the apps that we use, Instagram, Facebook, and so on, these are all tools of consumerism because they earn money by manipulating your data through advertisements, marketing, and so on. So we are actually the subject of marketing. We contribute our data in exchange for the service, and then they can try to understand the behavior of the user and so on. So I think we are talking about two different contexts by referring to Benjamin. So it's not that I speak against Benjamin, but I want to distance from Benjamin for the precise reason that we are now living in a different epoch. We need to re-evaluate our relation to technologies. So Benjamin, but a dogmatic reading of Benjamin could lead to maybe we can say a kind of technological determinism. Namely, we are determined by the technological progress. So a new technology actually determined our social, political, aesthetic condition. And this is, of course, adopted by many good Marxians, not Marxists, but good Marxians. They adopt this in history of art, in art historians, as well, to but also media theories. I mean, one of the most notorious is Hitler. Friedrich Hitler. For him, there is we can find a strong technological determinism. However, I think that after 100 years after Walter Benjamin, we need to re-evaluate our situation, and that's why I try to suspend the claim of Benjamin by showing that such a materialist reading of technology, or such a kind of determinist reading of technology, is very problematic, because by doing so we also indirectly also affirm the current technological development, and we see it as the proper way, or the proper path towards democracy. For example, Twitter. We know that Elon Musk wants to make Twitter the model of democracy, and we know the controversy between Donald Trump earlier, now it's very different, and Twitter before it was sold to Elon Musk, of course. But of course, also this form of democracy we find on Twitter, on Facebook, which is also a projection of a certain kind of liberal democracy we find already since the 19th century. So what I propose is that if today want to think about democracy, is not to think if Twitter, if Facebook is going to give us democracy. We know it is not possible. They need to make money, and they need to make as much money as possible. That is the golden principle of capitalism, of accumulation. So it's not that Facebook or Twitter is going to give us a democracy. No, it's an illusion, I would think. But rather we have to think about the relation between technology and democracy. We have been thinking technology as a means towards democracy. For example, the tools we can use for voting. Now, besides of Twitter and Facebook, there are other platforms we can use for voting. But what is this democracy? If one day everyone is able to vote with their smartphone, are we going to say we have democracy? And we know from this, we don't even have to wait until this day to arrive. We know this is not democracy. So what I propose is that this relation between democracy and technology has to be rethought. And one way of rethinking this is to think of a democratization of technology. And this democratization of technology is not only about let's have, because Facebook is controlled by capitalists. Let's build a Facebook that is owned by, for example, a co-op. No, I think this is not what I call democratization of technology. This for me still fall into the question of private property. earlier, because when I talk about degrowth, I said for them the question of private property still plays a central role. But no, it's not about who owns the platform, but the specific nature of the platform, and the design, the organization, the understanding of a user, the relation between user and other users, user and the system. All these have to be rethought. And this is what I called an example of what I called democratization of technology as one way to rethink our relation or the relation between democracy and technology.
So, drawing on the idea of democratization of technology, we would like to ask you if the implementation of technodiversity can be done without resorting, at least, to a project of digital literacy or cyber literacy.
Well, this is a big question, because when I say it's a big question, it's about our education system. It's about the future of university as well. Because today we talk very often about interdisciplinary research and so on, and as a way to overcome the kind of thing, isolation or separation of disciplines. And if you have the chance to ask ChatGPT, how are we going to resolve our global problems, you will see one point: interdisciplinary studies. You can do this, and you will really see this. Yeah? They said, we need to foster interdisciplinary studies and so on. There is a certain truth on that, and there is certain kind of cliche there, because, of course, today everyone talks about interdisciplinary studies, and it is also how a discipline is evaluated, or department is evaluated by the university and so on. But I think that this question has to be enlarged in the sense that before, let's say since the 19th century, that there has been already a separation between technicians or engineers who invent, develop, and maintain machines. And there are users or workers who work with these machines without knowing how exactly they work. So these are the users. We deal with input and output. And this lasts until our time, that to a situation that they form almost like a class, in the sense of Marx, that there is a class of engineers, of someone who have technical knowledge and someone who don't have, and they are in confrontation with each other. Inside the university, of course, humanities scholars and engineers, they were very difficult to talk because of and that makes, of course, interdisciplinary studies a key subject, because but if it is sufficient to overcome the problem that we have today is different. Now, I think that this question of digital literacy and cyber literacy has to be questioned, but also has to be enlarged. Enlarged in the sense that it is not, or how do we define technical knowledge? What is technical knowledge? Before, it is about how to how to do programming, if you learn how to do programming, you know how to make electronic circuit. These are very technical, but that's what we call technical knowledge. But today I think we have to enlarge the concept of technical knowledge. That's to say, because technical design itself actually involves many other kinds of knowledge. For example, in the design of Facebook, the immediate question that we encounter is, what is a user? What is a group? What is a society? What is a social relations? These are not engineering knowledges. Nonetheless, these are technical knowledges. Because an engineer will not be able to develop a program, to write a software, to design a software without asking these questions. However, these questions are not what they would learn in the inside engineering discipline today. No one is asking about these questions. If you are an engineer, you probably have some basic elementary courses you have to take. For example, ethics of technology, engineering and finance, something like this. So your question about digital literacy and cyber literacy, actually for me is a question of what exactly is technical knowledge today. Is technical knowledge, or does technical knowledge only belong to the kind of engineering knowledge that we understand, technically how to do programming, how to write programming, how to design electronic circuit and so on? No, for me it's not, because we have to enlarge the concept of technical knowledge. And in order to enlarge the concept of technical knowledge, that means we have to also enlarge engineering, the engineering discipline, but also humanities discipline. And this leads to a more fundamental question: is how universities today are going to confront this question. I don't think that we can resolve this question with interdisciplinary studies. Maybe we could have to create new disciplines. So, for example, I have some students who are engineers, and they decide to do a secondary degree in philosophy because they were not satisfied. So they want to do a second degree on philosophy. So some of them are doing a double degree in engineering and philosophy. And when I talk to them, they immediately realize the problems of the engineering educations. Because what I was trying to show to them is that the engineering questions, when they think about how to design a system, how to it actually involves many other questions or many assumptions. They have to make many assumptions, and these assumptions are not at all layman knowledge. It's not common sense knowledge. So that is what I would say. Indeed, it involves a knowledge, a project of education. But this project of education, we have to enlarge the concept of technical knowledge. That's to say, we have to think fundamentally, at least, for example, of engineering today.
In the introduction to the Brazilian edition of Technodiversity, you mentioned the need to think decolonization through technology. How does this logic apply in the European context today?
Right, so your question is how could we think about decolonization in Europe, or decolonization inside Europe itself? I think this is a big subject today, of course, about decolonization in Europe. For example, renaming streets, renaming museums, return objects, art objects to the indigenous countries or to the country of origin, for example. And this is happening, for example, in Belgium and other countries as well. But for me, this is not really a decolonization inside Europe, even though we read this on newspaper about as a decolonization, about integration and so on. But because I think again, the question of technology has been very much undermined, and how can we? Where shall we start? 2023, which was last year, when Emmanuel Macron visited China, and when he came back from China, I don't know if you remember what he said. He said that France should, defend its sovereignty. France should defend its sovereignty. Europe should consolidate its sovereignty. And what he means is that Europe have to maintain a different relation to the United States. 2023. This was already pronounced 20 years ago, 2003, in a letter signed by Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida. Derrida was very young. He was not here. I think he gave the name to be signed, to be used to sign this letter, where Habermas and Derrida also argue for the necessity to defend European sovereignty, because there was already some discussions in Spain and so on. So. But all this, of course, is about sovereignty, but most significantly is about what is Europe. How could Europe, or how does Europe perceive itself today, and also in the future? And one of the, if we can think about decolonization, maybe we can say, well, of course, this term can decolonization of technology. We can also has multiple senses, but we can also think of the relation between Europe and technology. What is the relation between Europe and technology? Especially regarding the question of sovereignty, regarding the future of Europe. What exactly is European technology today? Of course, we know that technology, modern technology, came from Europe and so on. But of course, today we are all using Facebook, we are using Google, we are using Twitter, which is the major European technology that we are using in the, online today. Virtually no significant technology. Maybe later we come back to the question of digital sovereignty. But I think this has been a question that has been very much debated in the past decades in Europe. How could Europe resist Google, which is in the name, under the title of American imperialism? How could Europe resist American imperialism? So Europe has been trying to do something, but it's not sufficient. But I wanted to twist this question a little bit. It's not only about resisting against American imperialism, which is obvious today, but I would rather follow what Stigler said, and here I refer to a small book, where actually two books that he published in around 2005, called Constituer l'Europe, Constituting Europe. This is not very serious work. Because it consists of several interviews and loosely connected articles. And where he argued, and I think very convincingly, he argued that for the future of Europe, that Europe, which we can interpret as the decolonization of Europe itself, then Europe should propose a new kind of individuation, which is not a kind of disindividuation based on consumerism. And of course, this new form of, or new way of individuation, or new model of individuation has to be mediated through digital technology. Because today, what kind of, we are using Instagram, which is a part of owned by Facebook, or Facebook, Twitter, and so on, or now it's called X. We are still within a kind of consumerist culture. And if we can talk about decolonization of technology in Europe, then I think this is one of the central questions that Europe should really take care of. That's to say, to propose a new model of individuation mediated through technology. Because for me, it's much less about digital sovereignty, which maybe we touch upon later, but a new model of individuation. So it's not, again, this is not about returning objects to Africa, to Latin America. I'm not saying it's not important. It's important. But it's not yet what we can call decolonization.
How do the politics of cosmotechnics avoid the pitfalls of other advocates of the local and diversity? For example, identity politics and nationalisms that do not contemplate the question of technology.
When we speak about different cosmotechnics, it could also easily be interpreted as a kind of, let's say, nationalism or localism. For example, Brazilian technology, Chinese technology, Japanese technology, when we give technology in the name of a country or a nationality, there is a risk of returning to a kind of localism, or certain kind of a really narrow sense of defining according to identity. This is, I believe that this is the danger that we all have to be have to pay attention. Now the question is that how can we avoid this falling back to a political identity? It's a very difficult question because today is, if we look at what is happening between China and USA, for example, the US sanction against Huawei, the company that produce mobile phones and 5G technology and so on, network technology and so on. In China, for example, there is a sentiment among many people who decide to abandon iPhone and to buy a Huawei in order to support, because Huawei stands for Chinese technology. So it's very easy for us to identify also a kind of to give a national identity to a certain technology, which actually is not that different from iPhone or Samsung. They run on Android, for example. Before now, Huawei want to develop their own OS because they cannot. The Android system they use, they cannot be updated anymore. Google basically banned that. But before actually it's not much different technology from a Samsung, from a smartphone based on Android, because it's based on the same operation system. But regardless, that people can still give it a national identity, and it can be also used to kind of provoke a national sentiment or nationalist sentiment of a technology. But this is not the kind of diversity that I'm talking about. This is nothing, even though there could be misinterpretations. Like, for example, they would say the current situation, like the sanction against development of microchips in China. They would say that maybe one day China can develop even more advanced microchips, and there's some kind of ethno-futurism at play. But I think this is of course very problematic, and this is not what I mean by cosmotechnics, because what I would propose is, or maybe we can say one way of overcoming these is what I propose already in my book Art and Cosmotechnics, what I call the individuation of thinking. So it's not what is thinking. I'm basically transform the Heideggerian question, what is thinking, to what I call what is the individuation of thinking. That's to say, a thinking that does not look for its root and essentialize itself by this retrospective of looking into its root, but rather a thinking that it is aware of its origin, but at the same time is open for an individuation, and this individuation is preconditioned by the necessity of conflict, of incompatibilities, of tensions. And only when I say individuation, I follow the model or the theory of Simondon. That's to say, as individuation can only take place when the incompatibility within a system arrived or reached a kind of threshold. Then there is a destructuralization within the system and the restructuralization of the system. So today, that's why I twist the question of what is thinking into what is individuation of thinking. And I will apply this also to the question of technology. That's because thinking also demands a technical support to make this thinking visible, this thinking could be inherited, could be studied, so on. So this is this question is very big. Is how to avoid identity politics, while at the same time not be fooled by the belief in the universalization of particular sets of knowledge. And for me, this is to confront this dilemma. Either you accept without resistance a universalization, which earlier we called globalization, because globalization is that we embrace the market. We open ourselves to the market, and then everything, this technology will come and transform the localities. But it's also not a way to resist by going back to the so-called origin. This is what Benjamin, earlier on we talked about Benjamin, and Benjamin wanted to attack this origin in the disguise of aura, for example. So therefore, we have to develop an agenda which I call the individuation of thinking, and that I continue to elaborate in one of my new books on the question of Europe.
So, in your text, 100 Years of Crisis, you say that, and I quote, "A third world war will be the quickest option if no country is willing to move forward," end of quote, to a truly international governing body. And you invite the reader to consider, quote, "before that day arrives," end of quote, what an organismic global immune system could look like. Could you elaborate on that?
Right, thank you very much. I mean, I wrote it a while ago, so I'm trying to remember what I said. But as I trying to, well, I think because this was written, I think in 2020, and now we are 2024, and I think it is our situation today is worse than 2020. I'm afraid that. Because at the time we are still talking about the possibility of wars. Today we are witnessing wars in between Russia and Ukraine, wars in the Middle East, which is escalating, and potential wars in Asia Pacific. And things can get worse, much worse. If you remember, on the 24th of March, the Prime Minister of Poland made a statement. He said, Europe is in the preparation for wars. And he said, I'm very serious. So I think we after 4 years, for me, it is the situation get worse, but also the possibility of a large-scale war is even closer. I know we are already in such kind of war, but in different means, through different means, economic, trade wars, or so on, and inflation everywhere, economic problems everywhere. Unemployment and so on. We don't need to wait for AI. This is already what is happening. But of course, for many people to confront this problem or to get out of this situation is a great reset. They have been talking about the great reset since the pandemic. And one way to reset this is having a war, and then we can probably resolve many of these problems through mobilization of resources, of material, of energies, of so on. And maybe afterwards we can have an organization which is more powerful than the United Nations. That, maybe we can think about, let's say, a world state, which is more powerful and which has really power on the sovereign of each state. Now, these are the speculations, but I think this is what I had in my mind 4 years ago when I wrote about this. And but regarding a global immune system, I don't think that I wasn't proposing that there is one solution. We adopt this solution and we resolve the problem, because I don't believe there is one solution. Even though the United Nations may believe that now we need a general solution to resolve the problem, but I think all these problems are so much are as localized as global as they seemed, and but such a global immune system, of course I was playing around the kind of the language of the pandemic and the immune system and so on. Again, for me, such a system, such a possibility is that how could we think of well, I think because I think I talked already mentioned quite a few points earlier already about diversification, about technologies, of avoiding or deviating from identity politics to individuation of thinking. So all these belong, or what I said earlier, belong to such an idea of a global immune system, which is not based on the current mode of competition, economical and technological competition that we are witnessing today. So it's not. So I cannot explain, or I cannot describe it to you, what exactly is this global immune system, because I'm not a policymaker. But what I can do is I try to show under what condition is such a global immune system not possible. And how could we think about that, for example, through the question of technodiversity, through the building or development of alternative technologies that allow us to think a different kind of solidarity that go beyond the limit of the sovereign states or borders and so on. But these are there is a set of proposals or a set of points that I'm trying to illustrate in my writings.
Your forthcoming book, Machine and Sovereignty, opens new dimensions in the planetary and cosmotechnical thinking you have developed so far. What compels you to write a more explicitly political work?
Well, there are many reasons. But one of the reasons, of course, is the relation between technology and the political philosophy. And even though today it's a self-evidence that technology is very important for politics, but in the history of political thought, actually, there is no explicit relation between technology and political philosophy per se. Now, for example, we will not find this in the writings of Leo Strauss. One of the most significant historian of political philosophy in the 20th century. You don't find the question of technology in Leo Strauss, even though only when he talked about Heidegger. When he was in the United States and he was not that old, and he was talking to, at the time Heidegger was not yet widely translated into English. So for me, I think that on the one hand there's a lack of an explicit elaboration, or lack of elaboration on the relation between political thought, political philosophy, and technology. That's to say, which in my book I call it a Tractatus Politico Technologicus, which is not yet available, and we have to make this, to elaborate on how it would look like. But this is very difficult because we have to go through the history of political thought, and we're trying to identify, well, in the way of like Derrida, to deconstruct the history of political philosophy by making the concept of technology explicit in this trajectory of political thought. And that was one of my ambition. Now the second reason is also related to the previous question: how could we think about a future politics? How could we think of a global immune system in the time when wars seems to be inevitable and more catastrophe related to the human technological development is going to take place? Now we are very much limited in the time of the pandemic, because I wrote this book during the time of the pandemic, and when I wrote this article, 100 Years of Crisis, I have already started writing on that. Actually, I wanted to write this book already in 2018. And the summer of 2018, after I finished my book, Recursivity and Contingency, I wanted to write about that. But I could not, because for many reasons I couldn't. I was, I told myself I have to write it, but I didn't know how. And also I didn't feel, the kind of, the urgency in myself that I must do this. There wasn't yet an imperative. But during the pandemic, it became an imperative because of the intensification of geopolitical problems, and the pandemic that was triggered by the pandemic. So I think that it became an imperative in me to write such a book, and I started. I went back to Hegel. I went back to Carl Schmitt, and I felt that there's urgency to overcome Hegel and Schmitt, even though these are the figures of the past. But I think Hegel was the philosopher who provided a philosophical justification of the political state. The outline of the philosophy of rights is basically to justify why a political state is necessary and why only within the political state is a freedom possible. And then Schmitt is different. Schmitt wants to justify that we need a Großraum, the big space, because the political state is declining in view of American imperialism. So he thinks about a different kind of political form, which I call the political form. And of course, today we have the European Union, but European Union is a different thing. But we have the Eurasian project, for example, of Alexander Dugin, and that was, of course, something that was reiterated by Putin at the beginning of the war, and so on. So I wanted to, it's a very ambitious project. First of all, I want to respond to the lack of elaboration of the relation between political philosophy and technology on the one hand, and secondly, the overcoming of the political form that we have inherited. So this was my kind of my imperative to write such a book.
Back to your plea for a new beginning in thought after Heidegger, that you also express as an epistemological revolution, and that falls largely on art, namely through the claim of a new aesthetic education. And I'm thinking of some of your essays, but also about the book on art and cosmotechnics. And so I was wondering whether such a plea risk repeating a structuring element of Western modernity, the hope that art might be the only reserve or alternative to modern technoscience. Don't we also risk, by placing such high expectations on art, to be condemned to then declare its end or its death, which is a theme that has various forms? We can speak about its industrialization, or a sort of division between authentic and unauthentic art. So I would like to ask you about these high expectations and going back to the aesthetic education theme.
Right. Thank you very much for this question. Of course, the question is very important. That there might be an overemphasis or over expectation on art, and especially when we think about contemporary art, when we think about the art market and so on. But I think for my part, it was also an attempt to criticize, to develop a critique of the arts industry, or contemporary art, but by returning to the very question, to the fundamental question of art, which I would describe as education of sensibility. And the term education of sensibility I actually adopted from Schiller. So in Schiller's letters on the education, on the aesthetic education of man, or of the human, where he talked about the education of sensibility. And so my book Art and Cosmotechnics start with the question of education of sensibility, which is the title of the introduction. That I propose to go back to this fundamental question of art, not as a presentation of an object which has market value and so on, but rather to going back to this fundamental function, maybe we can say the function of art, which you can find in Greek tragedy, we can also find in non-European art. And there is a certain kind of educational element, but it's not about a theory, it's not about logic, it's about certain sensibility. And this sensibility is actually something I think very important, which we may all call episteme. Episteme in the sense of Foucault, I would say. Now the reason for which I focus on this is that years ago, more than a decade ago, I was working a lot on the history of an exhibition of Jean-François Lyotard, Les Immatérieux. And this experience of Lyotard was very important for my reading of Lyotard's theory itself. And later this evening, maybe I probably will mention about this as well. Is that because for Lyotard, maybe we can say the postmodern is also kind of episteme. After the three epistemes that Foucault analyzed after the classical, modern, and so on, that the postmodern consists in a new episteme. And this new episteme was actually something brought about by technological development. Because in this exhibition of Lyotard, he's trying to, the term sensibility appears, when you look at the catalogue, it appears on every page about sensibility. Every page you see, you find the word sensibility. And what he means is that actually the exhibition want to introduce a sensibility of insecurity, of uncertainty, that the human can no longer understand itself as a substantial existence, which is very different from the modern subject. Modern subject is very firm with authority and so on, and we all know this. But there is something quite interesting in this setting, is the relation between episteme, art, and technology. And Lyotard didn't explain in this way. That is my reading of him, of the relation between, where it says episteme, arts, and technology, all connected. So when I was writing this book, Art and Cosmotechnics, my question was how could art respond to this new technological condition or the current technological development, because we talk about AR, VR, and so on all the time. And when I was teaching in Hong Kong, there was a huge enthusiasm about art and technology. There was so much money pumped into that to develop AR, VR, artificial intelligence, and so on. But actually, and I think this evening I will also talk about this, but there is a lack of, it seems to me there's a lack of grasp of the function of art in this particular moment of our history. So that's why I try to articulate this relation, to re-articulate this relation in my book. But I would not say this is an expectation as such. I would say this is a critique. A critique in the sense that I try to expose that even the way we talk about art making, or we talk about exhibiting, actually we often bypass this question. That is to say, which I can call it the function of art. We bypass this question, and in a way, when we think about the investments in art and technology, we also failed to address the relation between art and episteme. So, in the book, I argue for, I call for an epistemic revolution, not exactly an epistemological revolution, but epistemic revolution in the sense that we demand a different kind of sensibility today for us to conceive and respond to what is happening with ecological crisis, development of artificial intelligence, intensifying geopolitical conflicts. So that was at last that was my aim to address the relation between art and technology, not following a kind of art historian point of view, but by returning to the question of episteme, to the question of sensibility, to re-articulate the relation between art and technology.
I'd like to ask you a very last question regarding artificial intelligence and the future of art. You've written extensively on that topic. So in the past year, several artists have signed open letters that denounce AI's threat to their identities and creativity. How does artificial intelligence change the meaning and status of artistic work? This would be the first question. And associated to this one, will the role of the author become indistinguishable in the future of that of the prompt engineer?
Right. Well, yeah, I think, as we all know, that there was court case against Midjourney and so on because of copyright and so on, and there has been really the concern of many artists that in fact the creativity of AI is based on the abuse of the copyright, and because it basically takes things from the library, from already published or exhibited materials, or images or artwork or photographs of the artist. But if you ask me, I don't think that this is the biggest, or that for me this is not exactly the right question. As I will try to show later this evening in my talk, that we need to rethink the relation between art and its medium. And today, of course, we're thinking that artists should use this medium as much as possible. I know many artists who are traditional painters, and suddenly they are moved towards AI. They are working on AR, VR, AI, even though they didn't work on that before. But there is certain imperative in them to work on technology because the market will need it. The audience will feel something, want to see that as well. But I think the relation between art and medium is very different. For me, it is resistance. That's to say, art always resists its medium through the medium itself. So, when we think in this way, then the question of creativity as such, which is raised by this in these letters, acquires different meaning. That's to say, how could we resist such form or this form of creation through AI by opening a different kind of a different field? So to give an example, this evening I will talk more about that. But this will demand us to really to think about what really is artificial intelligence and what is the limit of artificial intelligence. When an artist still or subordinates himself or herself to the limits of AI, then it's problematic. But how could we realize the limit of AI at the same time that we can overcome its limit through the help of AI? Then when we need wisdom. And wisdom is not something we can learn from books. Wisdom is not something I can teach you, because I also don't have. But we can try to learn because we can only learn by ourselves. When you look at AI, what is AI doing? AI is basically a compressor, a compression of data. And so you provide so much data to the AI, and AI is an algorithm which is able to compress all this data with a computer program which is much smaller in size, but it is able to predict, to anticipate all this data, might want to say. So it's like, for example, ChatGPT. What is ChatGPT? The Google researchers said ChatGPT is the most advanced auto-completion system. Because when you write a message, when you use WhatsApp or that kind of messengers, you always have auto-completion. But ChatGPT is so far the best auto-completion system, because it compresses everything. It compresses not everything. It compresses a huge amount of data that it is able to auto-complete even itself. How could an artist react to that? Because auto-completion also means that it is able to create a space of probability, and it is able to calculate what is the most probable to be displayed or to come next, right? So if you look at AI generated image and so on, it's a play of probability. It's a game of probability. It's when you look at the image, it's actually a composition of the most probable images. And is this creativity? I don't think. Well, it has a certain kind of creativity, because creativity also has kind of combination. But I would think that the relation between art and AI is not simply about copyright. Of course, this could also be a very important subject. But rather, what could art do to resist this kind of medium by opening something that is which maybe we can call the improbable, if we want to follow Blanchard, or we want to follow even André Breton, to think about this question. So I think that in order to address this question, we need to have a very clear understanding of what is artificial intelligence, what is at stake in the current development of artificial intelligence. Very often we are very much we take AI in a very abstract way, and without seeing its limit, without knowing how to go beyond it. This for me would be the veritable task of art. Thank you. Thank you.